"You don't need to come anymore," my daughter said. And she didn't even look at me when she said it, just stood near the doorway, adjusting her dupatta like she had somewhere better to be, somewhere I didn't belong. And in that quiet moment, with the ceiling fan humming above us, and the faint smell of tea still in the room, something inside me went completely still, because I finally understood what had been happening for months. My own children were slowly removing me from their lives. I remember holding the edge of the table, my fingers tightening around the wood, as if it was the only thing keeping me steady. Not because I was weak, but because that one sentence carried the weight of everything they had never said out loud before. And still, I smiled. Because that is what mothers do when something breaks inside them. We smile, so no one has to see the damage we hold ourselves together, so others don't feel uncomfortable. We pretend everything is fine even when it isn't. But what they didn't know was this. By the time my daughter said those words, something inside me had already changed, quietly, carefully, without making a sound, and just a few days later, I was going to place something on that same table in front of all of them, something that would make sure they never looked at me the same way again. At that moment, my daughter had no idea what I had already started noticing, what I had already begun preparing for, and what I was no longer willing to ignore, but to understand why I didn't cry that day, why I didn't beg her to take those words back. You have to go back with me to the months before that moment, when everything still looked normal on the outside, but was quietly shifting underneath. Every morning before sunrise, when the world was still soft and forgiving, I would sit on the edge of my bed with my shawl wrapped tightly around my shoulders and count my pension money, slowly, carefully dividing it into small portions that never seemed enough: electricity, medicines, groceries, and then their needs, always their needs. My son Rashid would call first. Most months, his voice rushed, distracted already halfway into the conversation before I even said hello. "Ami, things are a little tight this month," and I would answer before he even finished. "It's okay, Beta, I understand," even if I didn't. Even if I had already planned how I would manage the rest of the month with less. Because that is what I had trained myself to do, to adjust, to make space, to give, without asking questions. My daughter Saba was softer in her approach but heavier in her expectations. She wouldn't ask directly. She would talk about rising school fees, about how expensive everything had become, about how difficult it was, managing everything, and somehow, without her saying it, I would already be reaching for my purse, already calculating what I could sacrifice this time. At the time, I told myself, this is what love looks like. This is what mothers do. We give, we support, we don't keep score. But what I didn't realize then was that love without boundaries slowly turns into expectation, and expectation quietly becomes entitlement. The house I lived in used to feel alive, filled with laughter, voices echoing through the rooms, the smell of fresh food, the comfort of belonging. But over time it became quieter, not peaceful, but empty, in a way that lingers, a silence that reminds you of what is missing more than what is present. Calls became shorter, visits became occasional, and when they did come, it didn't feel like they were coming home anymore. It felt like they were stopping by out of duty. And that was the part that hurt the most. Not the distance, but the change in meaning. But that wasn't what scared me most. What scared me was how normal it started to feel, how easily I adjusted to being less important in my own children's lives. One evening, Saba came over with her son Ahmed, and while he played quietly on the floor with toys I had saved for years, She sat on the sofa, scrolling through her phone, barely noticing me moving around the kitchen preparing tea. And when I placed the cup in front of her, she said something so casually that it took me a moment to understand what she meant. "You should really think about selling this house. Ami, it's too much for you now. Too much for me." Those words didn't sound like concern. They sounded like a decision that had already been discussed somewhere else. A plan I wasn't part of. And I nodded the way I always did, because I wasn't used to arguing, not with my children, not with the people I had spent my whole life protecting. But that night, lying in bed with the fan spinning slowly above me, I couldn't ignore the thought that kept returning, quiet but persistent. This wasn't about the house. This was about me, about where I fit into their lives now. And for the first time, I allowed myself to see it clearly. I was no longer part of their future plans. I was something they were trying to manage, to rearrange, to move. And what they didn't know was this. By the time they would finally say it out loud, by the time they would make their decision clear, I had already started making mine. And when that day came, I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I did something they never saw coming. The next time my daughter came over, I noticed something I couldn't ignore anymore. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't sit beside me. She didn't even pretend to stay longer than necessary. Instead, she stood near the door again, her body already turned halfway toward leaving, like she didn't want to settle into the space at all. And that was when I realized this wasn't just distance anymore. This was discomfort. "Amy, have you thought about what I said?" she asked, her voice calm, almost careful but not warm. Not the way a daughter speaks when she is concerned, more like someone checking on a task that hasn't been completed yet. And I kept my voice steady when I replied, "About what, Beta?" Even though I already knew. "The house," she said, finally looking at me. "It doesn't make sense for you to stay here alone." It doesn't make sense. It sounded reasonable, logical, even caring on the surface. But something about it felt rehearsed, like this conversation had already happened somewhere else before it reached me. And in that moment, something inside me became very quiet, because I understood this wasn't a suggestion anymore. It was a direction. But I didn't argue. I never did. Instead, I asked softly, "And where would I go?" And she hesitated, just for a second, but that second told me everything I needed to know. "We'll figure something out," she said quickly. "Maybe you can stay with Rashid for some time, or we can arrange something." Arrange something, that word stayed with me long after she left, because mothers are not things you arrange. We are not objects. You move when they become inconvenient. But by then, I had already started noticing the pattern too clearly to ignore. The way Rashid only called when he needed something. The way Saba avoided staying too long. The way every conversation slowly turned toward money space adjustments. And at the time, I told myself they were just busy, just stressed, just dealing with life. But deep down, I knew something else was happening. Something quieter, something more deliberate. But that still wasn't the moment that changed everything. That moment came a few days later, and it didn't come from what they said to me. It came from what they thought I couldn't hear. Saba had come over again, her voice lower this time as she spoke on the phone in the next room, not realizing the door wasn't fully closed, not realizing that every word was reaching me clearly. And I stood there in the kitchen, my hands still, my breath caught somewhere in my chest as I listened. "Yes, bye," she said. I spoke to her. She's still hesitant. And there was a pause followed by a quiet laugh that didn't belong in that conversation. "No, she doesn't understand yet, but she will." My fingers tightened around the glass. I was holding the weight of it, suddenly unfamiliar, as if I had forgotten how to hold things steady. We can't keep doing this forever, she continued. It's better if we decide now, before things get more complicated. Before things get more complicated, those words settled into me slowly, heavily, because I didn't need to hear Rashid's side to understand what this was. This wasn't concern. This wasn't care. This was planning. And I was the problem they were trying to solve. I sat down quietly, the room feeling smaller, the air heavier. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a mother. I felt like something temporary, something that had served its purpose and was now being phased out. And strangely, I didn't cry, because that moment didn't break me. It clarified everything. That night when the house was silent again, I didn't sit in the kitchen waiting for a call. I didn't try to convince myself everything would be fine. Instead, I did something I had never done before. I went to the old wooden drawer near my bed and opened it slowly. Inside were papers I had kept for years without thinking too much about them. Receipts, documents, small records of things I had paid for, handled, taken care of. Pieces of my life that I had never considered important enough to revisit. And as I started going through them one by one, something shifted inside me. Because for the first time, I began to see the full picture. Not just the emotions, not just the memories, but the truth. And the truth was, I had given more than they had ever acknowledged, more than they had ever respected. And now, they were trying to remove me from the very life I had spent years supporting. My hands stopped shaking. My breathing steadied. And in that quiet moment, sitting alone with those papers spread out in front of me, I realized something that changed everything. I was not powerless. And what I was going to place on that table was no longer just pain. It was proof. And once I made that decision, there was no going back. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was restless, but because something inside me had finally settled into a kind of clarity I had never allowed myself before. And as I sat at that old wooden table with the drawers still open beside me, I began going through every paper, slowly, carefully, as if each one carried a piece of a truth I had ignored for too long. There were receipts for repairs I had paid for myself, documents of small loans I had given Rashid over the years that were never returned, bank withdrawals that matched the exact months Saba had come to me with her soft voice and worried expressions, and as I aligned them one by one, a pattern began to form. Not emotional, not vague, but clear, undeniable and precise. At the time, I had never thought to keep track, never thought I would need proof of my own sacrifices because love doesn't usually ask for evidence. But now, looking at everything laid out in front of me, I realized something that made my chest tighten and then slowly release. This was no longer about feelings. This was about facts. But that wasn't even the most important part. What mattered more was what I found at the bottom of the drawer, a folder I hadn't opened in years. One that held the original documents of the house, the one place that still stood in my name untouched, unchanged, and for a moment I just stared at it, my fingers resting on the edges. Because suddenly everything they had been saying started to make sense in a way it never had before. This wasn't just about concern for me living alone. This wasn't about my comfort or my safety. This was about control, about decisions being made without me, about a future they were planning, where I was no longer central, but the house still was. And in that quiet moment, something inside me shifted completely, not with anger, not with revenge, but with a calm understanding that I had options, real ones, and that changed everything. Because until that night I had believed I was dependent on them, that I needed their approval. their support, their presence. But as I sat there, surrounded by the truth of everything I had carried alone for years, I realized the opposite was closer to reality. They had been depending on me, on my silence, on my willingness to give without question, on my habit of putting their needs before my own, without ever stopping to think what it was costing me. And for the first time, I asked myself something I had never asked before. What happens if I stop? That question stayed with me as the night stretched into morning, and by the time the first light entered the room, I had already made a decision, not an emotional one, not something driven by hurt, but something steady, something final. I carefully gathered the papers, arranged them neatly, placed them back into the folder, and closed the drawer slowly. Because I knew this wasn't something I would rush, this wasn't something I would reveal in anger. This would be done properly, clearly, in a way they could not ignore or dismiss. And as I stood up from that table, one thought remained with me, quiet but firm. The next time we all sat together, everything would change. Over the next few days, I didn't say anything to them, not to Rashid, not to Saba, not even when they called and spoke to me the way they always did, as if nothing had shifted, as if I was still the same woman who would quietly agree, quietly adjust, quietly disappear when needed. Instead, I listened more carefully than I ever had before, noticing the small details I had once ignored, the impatience in their tone, the way conversations were shortened, the way decisions were implied rather than discussed. And with each passing moment, my resolve became stronger, not louder, not visible, but deeper, more certain. At the same time, I began doing something else, something they never would have expected from me. I started asking questions, small ones at first, harmless ones about the house, about paperwork, about legal processes, and each time I did, I paid attention to their reactions, the slight pause, the change in tone, the careful answers that avoided saying too much, and that told me everything I needed to know. They were already thinking ahead, already planning, already assuming that I would follow whatever path they decided for me. But they didn't know that I had already stepped onto a different path. One afternoon, Rashid came over something he hadn't done in weeks, and I could tell immediately that this wasn't a casual visit. There was a purpose behind it. Something rehearsed in the way he spoke, in the way he avoided sitting too comfortably, and after a few moments of unnecessary conversation, he finally said it. Ami, we were thinking it might be better if we start making some decisions about the house now, before things get complicated later. Before things get complicated. The same words, the same tone, the same quiet pressure wrapped in concern. And I looked at him for a moment, really looked at him, not as my son, not as the child I had raised, but as someone standing in front of me asking me to step aside from my own life. And for the first time, I didn't respond the way he expected. Instead of agreeing, instead of nodding, I simply said, "We will talk about it properly." He seemed slightly confused by that, as if the sentence didn't fit into the version of me he had grown used to, and I could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the small crack in his confidence, because this wasn't the response he had prepared for. But I didn't explain myself. I didn't argue. I didn't reveal anything yet, because I knew timing mattered, and this conversation was not going to happen in pieces. It was going to happen all at once. And as he left that day, I knew something had already shifted, not just inside me, but in the space between us. Something subtle but irreversible, because for the first time, I was no longer reacting to their decisions. I was preparing my own. And when that moment came, they would have no control over it. I chose the day carefully, not randomly, not emotionally, but with intention, because I wanted all of them there. Rashid Saba, both in the same room, sitting at the same table where so many years of our lives had unfolded, where I had once served them food, listened to their stories, solved their problems, and quietly held everything together without ever asking for anything in return. When I called them and asked them to come, I kept my voice calm, steady, giving nothing away. And perhaps that was why they didn't suspect anything. Perhaps that was why they came without hesitation, expecting another conversation they could guide, another situation they could manage. But this time, they were wrong. They sat down across from me, exchanging brief glances as if silently coordinating what needed to be said. And for a few moments, no one spoke. The room filled with a quiet tension that neither of them seemed to fully understand yet, and I could see it in their expressions. They were waiting for me to begin expecting the usual softness, the usual hesitation. Instead, I reached beside me and placed the folder on the table. Slowly, deliberately. And for the first time, both of them went completely silent. "This," I said calmly, resting my hand on it, "is everything." They didn't understand at first, I could see that clearly. But as I opened the folder and began taking out the papers one by one, placing them in front of them, receipts, records, documents, dates, amounts, everything carefully arranged, everything undeniable, their expressions began to change. Confusion turned into discomfort. Discomfort into realization, and realization into something they couldn't hide anymore. "I didn't keep these to remind myself of what I gave you," I continued, my voice steady, without anger, without raising it. "I kept them because somewhere, without realizing it, I knew one day I might need to remember the truth." No one interrupted. No one argued, because there was nothing to argue with. "And this," I said, placing the final document on the table, the one that mattered most, "this house is still in my name, and it will remain that way." The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before it, because this was not the outcome they had expected, not the version of me they had prepared for, and for the first time, they were not in control of the situation. "I am not moving," I said quietly but firmly, "and I am not something you can arrange." Saba looked down. Rashid didn't speak, and in that moment, something shifted completely, not just in the room, but in the balance of everything we had been for years. Because this time, I had not reacted. I had decided. And whether they were ready or not, everything had changed. For a long moment after I finished speaking, neither of them said anything, and the silence that filled the room was not the quiet we were used to. It was heavier, sharper, the kind that forces truth to sit in front of you, whether you are ready for it or not. And I could see it clearly now. The way their expressions shifted, the way they avoided looking directly at the papers spread across the table, because those papers were no longer just documents. They were a mirror, and for the first time, they were seeing something they had never expected to face. Rashid was the first to move, his hand reaching toward one of the receipts, flipping it over as if trying to find something to question, something to challenge. But there was nothing unclear about what was written. No confusion, no missing pieces, just a record of years they had never thought would matter. "Ami, what is all this?" he asked finally, his voice lower than usual, not confident, not certain. And for a brief second, I saw something in him I had not seen in a long time. Hesitation. "It is the truth," I replied calmly, not raising my voice, not rushing my words, because I no longer needed to defend myself. Everything that needed to be said was already in front of them. Saba shifted in her seat, her discomfort more visible now, her fingers tightening around the edge of her dupatta as she glanced between the papers and my face, as if trying to understand how the woman they had slowly learned to overlook was now sitting in front of them with something they could not ignore. "We were only thinking about what's best for you," she said softly, and I listened carefully, not to the words, but to the space behind them, the space where intention lives. And for the first time, I did not accept it at face value. "What is best for me," I said, just as quietly, "is not something you decide without me." That was when the shift became undeniable. Because this was no longer a conversation they were guiding. This was something they were responding to. Rashid leaned back slightly, his expression tightening, and I could see the discomfort turning into something else. Now, something closer to realization, because what I had placed on the table was not just emotional resistance, it was structure, it was clarity, it was something that could not be dismissed as a mother being sensitive or misunderstood. "So, what are you saying?" he asked, and I met his gaze without hesitation. "I am saying," I replied, my voice steady, "that from now on, everything will be done properly." The word properly lingered in the air, heavier than the rest, because it carried a meaning they both understood but had never expected me to use. And that was the moment the law entered the room, not as a threat, not as something loud or dramatic, but as something quiet and final, something that changes the rules whether you like it or not. Because from that day forward, nothing between us would be informal again. After that afternoon, something shifted in a way that could not be undone. Not in a dramatic explosion, not in raised voices or arguments, but in something far more telling: their tone, the way they spoke to me, the way they chose their words more carefully, the way pauses became longer, as if they were now thinking, before saying things they had once said without hesitation. Rashid called 2 days later, his voice noticeably softer, almost cautious, asking how I was, something he had not asked in a long time, and I answered simply, without adding more than necessary, because I understood what this change was: not guilt, not sudden awareness, but adjustment. They were adjusting to a version of me they did not recognize. Saba visited again later that week, but this time she didn't stand near the door. She sat down properly. Her phone kept aside her attention fully in the room, and for a moment, it almost felt like something had returned, like the past had found a way back into the present. But I knew better. This was not the past returning. This was a reaction to something new, something they had not prepared for. "Amy, you didn't have to do all that," she said carefully, referring to the papers, to the conversation, to everything that had unsettled them, and I looked at her quietly, because this was the moment that mattered. Not what she said, but what I chose to accept. "Yes," I replied after a pause. I did. There was no anger in my voice, no accusation, just certainty. And that certainty was something she could not push aside, something she could not soften with familiar words, because this time I was not trying to keep things comfortable. I was trying to keep them clear. They spoke differently now, both of them, not openly admitting anything, not apologizing directly, but changing in small ways that revealed more than any words could have. And I observed it all without reacting too quickly, because I knew something important. Change that comes from pressure is not always permanent, and I was no longer interested in temporary adjustments. I was watching, carefully, patiently, because this was not about winning a moment. This was about understanding whether anything real remained underneath everything that had happened. And slowly, the truth began to show itself. Days passed, then weeks, and on the surface, things seemed calmer. Conversations were more measured visits, slightly longer, and for anyone looking from the outside, it might have seemed like everything had settled, like a misunderstanding had been resolved, like a family had found its balance again. But I knew better, because once you see something clearly, you cannot unsee it. Once you understand your place in someone's life, you cannot pretend it is something else. And that was why I made my final decision quietly, without announcing it, without creating another moment at the table, because this was not something I needed them to agree with. This was something I needed to do for myself. One morning, I gathered the same folder again, the same papers, the same documents, but this time, I added something new to it, something that had not been there before, something that completed everything I had started that night when I first opened that drawer. And as I closed it carefully, I felt a calm I had not felt in years, not relief, not happiness, but something steadier, control. Because for the first time, my future was not something being discussed in another room, not something being decided in conversations I was not part of. It was something I had taken back completely. Later that week, when both Rashid and Saba came to visit again, unaware of what had changed, unaware of what I had already set in motion, I watched them sit across from me, more careful now, more aware, but still not fully understanding. And I realized something in that moment. They thought the conversation at the table had been the end. They thought that was where everything had shifted. But they were wrong. That was only the beginning, because what I had done now, what I had put into place without telling them, was not something that could be argued with, not something that could be reversed, not something that depended on their approval. And when they finally found out, they would understand something they had never considered before, that the woman they thought they could slowly move out of their lives had quietly made a decision that removed their control completely. And this time, only consequences.